Hi, everybody, and welcome. We are so excited today to start our new show on Onwards and Upwards. My name is Tanya Friedman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Connetics USA, and we help healthcare organizations, acute care hospitals, nursing homes, rehab facilities, surgery centers all over the US with the nursing shortage by bringing in internationally educated nurses. And I have with me today my two colleagues, Carl and Jennifer. Hi, Carl. Hi, Jennifer.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Welcome. My colleague Denise Gavica Perez was also going to be here, so she might be joining us shortly. She was having a little technical hitch, but we're going to get started. Oh, there comes Denise. Hi, Denise.
Hello.
Welcome.
Sorry about that, Tanya.
No problem. No problem. It's Friday. We have technical hitches. What can we do? But you're here now. So welcome.
Thank you.
So welcome to everybody who is watching all over the world. I know there are a lot of nurses all over the world that are interested in coming to the US. And today's topic is going to be the TN. So that is what we're going to be speaking about today. And we are going to be picking the brains of all of our legal experts who are going to be telling us all about the TN and what that entails and who that applies to, who's eligible, and how this can be processed. Okay, so let's get started. So I think Denise, Jennifer, and Carl, if you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and just a bit about your history. Maybe let's start with Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm a certified immigration law specialist. I've been practicing immigration law exclusively for over a decade. I started working with registered nurses about 5 years ago, actually with attorney Carl Schusterman. So he was sort of my mentor, I would say. So everything I know is mostly from him.
Okay, well, there you go, Carl. Great accolades for Carl. Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Denise?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Tanya. I am Denise Gavica Perez. I have been practicing for the past 20 years, business immigration, working with many hospitals nationwide, working with the Connetics team. I work at Ackerman. It's a national law firm. I'm a partner in the Miami office, and I have a lot of wonderful experience working with the nurses for the past many years. So thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And Denise and I personally worked together for many, many years, as of Carl and I. So, for anybody who's watching this, these are the experts in America on the TN process. Carl, what about you?
Well, I formerly worked for the Immigration Service for a few years, where I met my wife, who's from Cebu in the Philippines. And I think it was really because of her. She had some nieces who were coming over, and they referred me tons of Filipino nurses. And I think Jennifer and I and the rest of the people have probably immigrated over 10,000 nurses from the Philippines. We represent hundreds of hospitals across the country. And the nurse, despite the fact that 20 years ago I testified in front of the Senate about the nurse shortage, it hasn't gotten any better, and we still need foreign nurses to come in the U.S.
Yeah, you are so right, Carl. I don't even think it's really a shortage anymore. I think it's a nursing crisis. I think the word shortage is just, that was before the pandemic. With the pandemic now, what we're seeing in the US, and I know everybody on this panel can attest to this, is we are just seeing a massive, massive crisis, a need for international nurses. There just simply aren't enough nurses in the US. So if you are an international nurse that is sitting in your home country right now, and from the Connetics perspective, Carl mentioned Philippines and Denise and Jennifer, but we recruit from 60 countries all over the world. So if you are in your home country right now and wanting to come to the US and wanting to live the American dream, because the American dream is very much alive and well, I think now is really the time to do it. There are basically two ways that nurses can come to the US. The one is on the EB3 green card. And for those of you who didn't watch our show last month, please do so, because we spoke about the EB3 green card in a 3-day marathon. Carl and Denise were part of that 3-day marathon. And we spoke about the consular process specifically. Today, we're going to be speaking specifically about the TN. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and I will try to get through as many questions as possible. We will be speaking for the next 30 to 45 minutes, and the panel will be explaining the TN process, and then we'll be taking as many questions as we can. By the way, Carl, I see that Irene said she's watching, and she's from Cebu too. So there you go.
Very good. Thanks, Irene.
Okay, so let's start with Denise. What is the TN?
Okay, so the TN is one of several non-immigrant worker visa classifications that allow individuals, professionals from Mexico and Canada to work in the U.S. For specific occupations that are on what's called the NAFTA list of occupations, and nurses fall under that list. So nurses from Mexico and Canada only, who have citizenship in Mexico and Canada, because they can have citizenship in other countries, they are allowed to enter the U.S. with a TN worker visa if certain requirements are met. Okay.
So some key things there. Thank you for that overall explanation, Denise. So some key things there is that the nurses have to be citizens of Canada and citizens of Mexico. And you mentioned also non-immigrant. Carl, what is the difference between the TN and an EB3 green card?
So, yeah, so in lawyer terminology, immigrant means somebody who is going to stay in the U.S. permanently. So that would be somebody with a green card. A non-immigrant is somebody who has a temporary visa to work, study, or visit in the United States. So the TN is a temporary non-immigrant visa, but as we'll talk about later, you can also transition from the temporary visa and get a green card once you're in the U.S.
Okay. All right. So Jennifer, I have a question here from a nurse, and I'm going to try and get through as many of the questions as possible. I see there are a lot coming into the chat already. But I have a question here from a nurse called Maria. I'm a Filipino nurse. I'm a permanent resident. Can I apply for the TN? I'm a permanent resident in Canada, I think she means.
Oh, okay. Not unless she's a citizen of Canada. And that's what Denise was touching on, that you do have to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico for the TN.
Okay, so permanent resident cannot apply. And just to take that question a little further, can Maria apply for an EB3 green card if she's a permanent resident in Canada, if she meets the licensing requirements? Carl? Or Jennifer, sorry.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, of course. That doesn't, you would have to go by the country visa categories, but there's no reason that she couldn't apply for an EB3.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to read out a few of the questions in the chat. So let me just see. Okay, so Irene, I know Irene, given the retrogression situation and your TN visa is about to expire, is there a chance that it can be affected and will not be renewed? Denise, can you maybe take that question?
So given the retrogression situation and your TN is about to expire, is there a chance that you will be affected by? Well, I mean, they can renew their TN. The retrogression does not impact, as Carl mentioned, the permanent residence is separate from non-immigrant. So immigrant is permanent, non-immigrant is temporary, so you can renew that temporary status as long as you qualify. You can extend it indefinitely. The TN doesn't have a validity period, an invalidity period.
Okay, so it doesn't expire, Irene, I think is the short answer. Carl, can you maybe talk a little bit about the retrogression? I know we're speaking specifically about the TN visa, but obviously there are some nurses that are in the US on a TN visa and are now worried about the retrogression.
Okay, so the retrogression applies to green cards. There are a certain amount of green cards that can be issued each year in different categories. So in the employment categories, there's 140,000 a year, although unused numbers from the family categories go over to the employment categories. So we're looking at the best year since I've been an immigration attorney, and that's over 40 years already. There's going to be 290,000, over double the number of green cards given out to people through their jobs this year. So this is the perfect time to apply. However, the numbers have moved forward so rapidly in the last year that the State Department, and we have a page on our site with the video if you want to watch the Charlie Oppenheim, my friend from the State Department, actually talk about exactly how he figures out the numbers. But they're predicting that instead of being current, now current means you're at the front of the line. It's like you're going to a movie and you just walk right in. You don't have to wait in line. So the Philippines have been current for quite a few months right now, and most of the rest of the world has been current also. But in November, Charlie is predicting that there is going to be a retrogression. So there may be like a few months that somebody will have to be petitioned by their employer and then have to wait a few months before they can apply for the green card. But if they're in the U.S. on a TN visa, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. They can just stay, wait those few months, and then they can apply for, we call it adjustment of status. That's a term for getting your green card in the U.S., which I highly recommend rather than going back to the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines to get your green card.
Okay, so that was another question that was coming up. Is it better to do, if you're on a TN, to do an adjustment of status process or a consular process for your green card? And you saying it's better to do adjustment of status?
Right. I mean, number one, the embassy in Manila has been mostly closed, and you know the nurses and everybody else, they rank under different priority criteria. So you may be able to get a fast interview and you may not be able to get a fast interview. If you're in the United States, not only are the immigration offices, and Jennifer can talk about this because she's constantly getting green cards for people at the different immigration offices, but not only are they opening up more in the United States, but if something would go wrong and like you don't have the paperwork and you get a letter from immigration saying, come back and bring this. And in the meantime, you can keep working. If you go to the embassy in the Philippines and they say, oh, you need paperwork 1, 2, and 3, well, you're stuck there. You don't have a job until you get the green card and come back. So I would highly advise people who are here on TNs to just adjust their status, not go back to the embassy.
Okay, so good advice. Thank you for that, Carl. A follow-up question on Irene's side is, I understand that I would have to wait for visas to be available, but can my case still be filed for the green card? Can my I-140 still be filed, I think is what we're asking here, even if there's a retrogression?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. All right. We have a question from Chitra, who's asking, oh, sorry. I'm going to come back to Chitra's question. We have a question from, I think it's IB Togi. I hope I've said that correctly, who's saying, do we need to keep the CGFNS CES report valid for the TN visa interview? We have a graphic about who's eligible to receive the TN. If maybe Jennifer, if you want to maybe just go through that with everybody and just explain who is eligible to receive the TN.
Sure. I mean, again, like we've said, you have to be a citizen of either Canada or Mexico. So, you know, permanent resident is not going to fly with that. You do have to be one of these specifically listed professions. Obviously, registered nurse, which we're mostly talking about today, is one on the NAFTA list. So the list is specific. You'd have to look at that. And that it has to require, you know, some type of professional, whether that's a diploma, a degree, a certificate. You would need all of that lined up. That you do have a job or prospective employment, that the employer provides, you know, an employment letter. You can't just be working for, you know, yourself. So maybe a hospital or a dialysis clinic or something like that. They'd have to give you a job offer. And that you, like I mentioned, you have to qualify for that profession. So as a registered nurse, you have to, you know, complete your bachelor's and get you have to pass your certificates. And then also, which is, I think, getting to the question that the person was asking, you must have a visa screen, as well as the CGFNS when you do apply for the TN.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that. And Denise, can you just talk a little bit about the visa screen?
Sure. Yes. So the visa screen is issued by CGFNS. The nurse has to meet certain requirements, such as they have to complete the Nclex, or they have to the predecessor to the Nclex. They have to have that. They have to have an education that's equivalent to a U.S. degree in nursing, and back to the Nclex, they just have to prove that they're proficient in English as well. So that's part of it. So they have to meet those and other requirements in order to qualify for the visa screen. And as Jennifer mentioned, you need the visa screen in order to obtain the TN. So it's absolutely necessary. Without it, even if you meet all the other requirements, you cannot be issued a TN.
Okay. And just a note to everybody that the visa screen is valid for 5 years. So it's really important to make sure that the visa screen is valid when you're going to be crossing the border and getting the TN. Okay, we have a lot of people watching. So we've got Jessa is watching from Montreal. Hansel, hi Hansel. I know Hansel from Saskatchewan. Victoria's from Calgary. We have a lot of people that are watching. So Jocelyn is asking, is answering the question that IB Togi had about the CES report. Can you answer that to anyone in the panel specifically? Does the TN officer, or does the Canadian, when they go through the Canadian border to come into the US, do they need the CES report? No, everyone's done.
I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure what's a CES.
So the CES report is required by some of the nursing boards when nurses apply to take the Nclex exam. So some of, like for instance, Texas asks for the CES report.
Oh, okay.
So I think just, you know, and maybe because the lawyers are used to the immigration side,
right.
everybody to know on the licensing side, that, you know, the CES, some officers are asking for that report, for the CES report. So if you have that, that is a plus. What we actually tell our nurses is if you have that, put that, have 2 folders, one folder of the required documents that you need in order to apply, and we're going to go through that list of documents, and then have it in a second folder, any supporting documents. So the CES might be like a supporting documents. A supporting document. Claudine is asking, can I have multiple TN visas? Carl.
Well, you can have, I think not multiple visas, but I think she's saying, can I work for multiple employers in the U.S.? And so, yes, if the different employers submit a form called an I-129 form and get it approved by the Immigration Service, you could work 20 hours for employer A, 20 hours a week for employer B.
Okay.
And as Carl mentioned, the term is called concurrent employment. So that's what they would be requesting. So they have to have the first one, and then after that, they ask for concurrent employment with a second or third multiple employers.
Okay. So there we go, Claudine, answer to your question. That's why we're so grateful to the experts for giving their time and sharing information. Immigration and licensing and credentialing is so overwhelming and so, just complicated and scary for many nurses that we're just so grateful to the experts for giving your time now and sharing your knowledge and your expertise so that we can shed some light on this immigration process. IB Togi is asking again, can I work under 2 employers at the same time? Jennifer's nodding her head. Correct. Okay, Victoria is asking, is it true you cannot be a dual citizen, Canadian and US citizen, if you are Filipino born?
No, that's not true at all. My son, in fact, who's only half Filipino, but he's a Canadian and a US citizen, so there's no problem.
Okay, good. There you go, Victoria. Okay, Claudine is asking an interesting question. How soon after obtaining a TN can someone get a green card? Carl.
Oh, me again. Okay. There's no time limit, but here, as a former Immigration Service attorney, there are certain things that you should do, even though it's not actually written into the law. So remember, we talked about non-immigrants and immigrants, the non-immigrants being on temporary status, the immigrants being on green card status. So the TN is the type of visa where you're supposed to have no immigrant status, no immigrant intent, no intent to stay permanently in the US. So, I realize that a huge number of people that are coming on TNs would like to get green cards, almost, we've represented thousands of people like that. But the smart thing to do is when you come into the US, don't immediately apply for a green card the next day. A good waiting time is 90 days. Once you've been in the US for 90 days, you can have an epiphany and say, oh my God, I just love it here. I'm not going to go back to Toronto or Vancouver. I want to stay in the United States, and have your employer apply for the green card petition at that time.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Chitra is asking, how long does it take for a nurse to migrate to the US after the Nclex, Denise?
Well, it depends. It depends what country they're from, if their immigrant visa is available. Assuming that the visa is current, from the time that the I-140 is filed until they arrive, it could take about a year or less. It depends if the immigrant visa is current for that person where they're from their country of birth, and if the process has already been started for the immigrant visa, because part of it is a prevailing wage determination, and as we all know, that's taking about 5 to 6 months, or maybe sometimes even more, to obtain before you can even file the Form I-140. So, but I would say if all the stars are aligned, and you have the prevailing wage available to the employer, they have the prevailing wage available, it would take about a year, as long as immigrant visas continue being available within a year, because that also has an impact on the process. It's not when an immigrant visa becomes available, it's how soon does the officer get to your file in order to process the paperwork. Sometimes they take months to get to the file, even though there's an immigrant visa available today, let's say. It may not be available in January by the time they get to the actual the petition, the documentation, the adjustment of status application if they're here, or the appointment that they can be scheduled for overseas. It really has so many different factors that influence the result. But I would say about that timeline.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I think for anybody watching, obviously with an immigrant visa, with an EB3 green card, we have to also take into consideration, as Denise said, we're in the middle of a pandemic, unfortunately, and there are a lot of extraneous factors that nobody ever anticipated. And right now, for example, we're seeing massive backlogs at the with expediting cases. So unfortunately, because of the staffing shortages in many of the consulates. So unfortunately, it's there are other factors that can influence that timing. But thank you for that general guidance. And Jennifer, what would you say to Chitra if she's speaking about the TN specifically? How long does it take for a nurse to migrate to the US after they pass the Nclex?
Well, the TN, you can apply at the border itself. So once you have, everything lined up, you pass the Nclex, you have a job offer, you have the offer letter, and get all your documents together, you can apply at the border. So in theory, it could be a much faster. It's not like you're waiting for the consulate to schedule, at least Canadian. If you're from Mexico, you do have to go through the consulate, but you're not waiting to get an appointment, which is a lot of right now, especially with the pandemic, like you were mentioning. There's huge shortages at the consulate, huge backlogs, taking months to get interviews. So since you can just apply at the border, it can be a faster process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So really at the end of the day, Chitra, it's about the licensing side, and it's how far you are in that licensing process. So if you were not trained in English, have you already passed the Ielts exam? If you have already obtained a visa screen certificate, if you've got documents from your home country, if you were not trained in Canada, for example. So it's really dependent on the licensing piece and the timing on the TN side. I mean, if you've got everything, you can, and you've got a job offer, you can pretty much come through today, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about how to apply, so the process, and we're going to break it down into two parts, one for the Canadian citizens, and then we're going to speak after that for the Mexican citizens, because the process is a little different. One is called the TN1 and one is called the TN2. Canadians are TN1. So Denise, maybe do you want to take us through this process of how to apply as a Canadian citizen?
Sure, absolutely. So for Canadians specifically, not for nationals from Mexico, because they have to go through the U.S. consulate, the first thing, as far as gathering the documentation, first they have to gather the documentation, their credentials, the visa screen, provide it to, if they're working with an attorney, they provide it to the attorney. And then in the meantime, the attorney gathers information from the employer, which goes specifically to the job offer. So they obtain the job description, prepare a letter, the employer signs the letter, and basically the Canadian national goes to through the airport, and they cross the border and they do their documentation. They being the government reviews it to make sure that they qualify, that the occupation falls under the list of NAFTA occupations. That they have the credentials. The officer will review all of their credentials to make sure that they meet the requirements, that they have the CPFNS, etc., the degree, and then once, as long as they have everything in order, they can enter, like you said, even in 1 day, or 2 days, 3 days. It's rather quick as long as they meet all of the requirements. That's on the Canadian side. And I don't know if you want me to cover the Mexican side, because they have to go to the U.S. consulate, but briefly, they have to complete a DS-160, a form DS-160, schedule an appointment at the U.S. consulate.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you, Denise. I'm just would like to show that graphic of the Mexican side as Denise is talking, so that's helpful for any Mexican nurses. There we go.
Yes. Yes, perfect. Sorry, Tanya.
No problem.
So, the online visa application form is the DS-160 form. And that's a form that the nurse has to complete in order to schedule their interview. Then they're going to be provided a barcoded form. They schedule their interview, and as indicated there on the list, they prepare for their interview. Basically, the attorney would prep them to make sure that they don't indicate that they want to apply for permanent residence if that's their intent in the future, because as Carl mentioned, you're not supposed to have immigrant intent when you request a TN. So they're prepared for their interview. They gather the required information, which they should have already prior to scheduling their interview. They should have that with them, and then they attend their interview with the employer letter, other documents that we provide to prove that the employer is actually real, their credentials, and then they obtain a visa stamp in their passport, and they enter with the visa. As soon as they enter with the visa, the TN visa, then they're in visa status once they're physically in the U.S.
Okay, so thank you for taking us through that, two slightly different processes. So I'm getting a lot of questions here just about how to apply. So one of the nurses, Paul, is saying, I'm originally from the Philippines. I was an RN in the Philippines, but I'm not an RN in Canada. Do I qualify to apply for a TN if I pass the Nclex?
Right. You do qualify. You're not required to be an RN in Canada as long as you were an RN in the Philippines. So you're only required to be a Canadian citizen.
Okay. All right. So Paul, there you go. And just to let any nurses who are watching know that if you are placed through Connetics USA, we also have an Ielts Scholarship right now. We introduced this last year because of the pandemic. We were really just looking for ways to help nurses. And really go the extra mile, because we know that nurses, it's been tough on everybody, but especially nurses. I know that there are many nurses that went to Canada many years ago when there was a retrogression in the US. So you might be an RN in your home country and might not have passed the Ielts. And because you were not trained in English, would need to pass the Ielts exam. So this is really the Connetics gift to those nurses. So if anybody is watching, please let us know. We'd be happy to help you with that. And it's a free Ielts course. We've had enormous success with the Ielts course. We have many nurses that failed the Ielts many times before, then came to Connetics, did the course, and have been successful. You can watch them on our social media. We have one nurse, Bert, by the way. He failed, I think it was 7 times. He came to Connetics, passed on the 8th time, and he got an 8 in speaking. Spread the word about our Ielts course, because we're really excited about that. If you were not trained if you were trained in the Philippines, for example, or in India or Africa, or wherever your home country was, and you're now a Canadian citizen, and even if you're not working as an RN in Canada, you can apply. Obviously, you would need the Nclex. We have a question here from Mercily, who's saying, I have heard that one has to cross the border within 10 days of the start date on the letter. Is that correct? Jennifer?
I believe that you have the employer letter has to be within 30 days. Correct me if I'm wrong, Denise or Carl, but that's what we've been making sure the employer letter was good for 30 days.
From a practical perspective, yes, Jennifer, absolutely. I'm sorry, Carl. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I think there's a requirement on the Canadian side that if they're going to give you a TN, you have to start work in the United States in the next 10 days.
Yeah, correct. And that is our understanding as well.
From a practical perspective, you want to make sure the letter's dated as current as possible, just to avoid any issues with officers that are going to say, well, is the job available? Let's say it's on a Saturday that they want to cross and the office is closed, they can't reach the employer. Just to make it simple, make sure that the letter's dated as close as possible to the date when they're entering the United States.
Okay. Thank you, Denise and Carl. Okay, so we have a question from Abed. Abed is asking how it takes time and or the process to a nurse from Palestine with the Nclex and the Ielts. Is it available for Middle Eastern nurses? Abed, the answer to that's not really an immigration question, but obviously you need those licensing criteria in order to get the immigrant visa, and the answer is yes. So right now Connetics have a scholarship for selected nurses, where we will pay for a review course for selected nurses to do a course to prepare them for the Nclex. Obviously, you need the Nclex and the Ielts if you were not trained in English, and I've already spoken about the Ielts. We have a question from Ahalam Nasser. I've been a nurse for 10 years. We had the CRNE exam in Canada instead of the Nclex at that time. Will that be equivalent to the Nclex qualification?
No, you're still going to need the Nclex, so get ready to study.
Yeah, so Alan, unfortunately, you need the Nclex. So if you are looking to come to the US, apply to ConneticsUSA.com /application, and we'd be happy to consider you for the Nclex Scholarship. Okay, Melvin is asking, it depends which border you go. For me, I went to I don't see the rest of that question, Melvin, but I think Melvin is asking about, does it matter which border you go to?
Yes, yes. So on our I'll put in a plug, but I think it's a good resource. If you go to our website, which is just my last name, schusterman.com, we have a nurse immigration guide, and we have links to the different government agencies. Click on the CBP link. The CBP is the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, and there's 14 different places that you need to cross in one of those 14 different places in Canada, because there's hundreds of border crossings, but the CBP officers who are trained in TNs are only at 14 of those. So make sure you pick the appropriate airport or the appropriate land crossing area. Otherwise, you may be wasting your time trying to get over the border.
Okay, so that is great advice. Thank you for sharing that, Carl. Is there any additional advice or best practice from the panel on how to approach getting the TN? Because different nurses have had different experiences. Some people say, oh, well, it's better to fly than to drive. Some people say it's important to go in business hours, make sure that you get the contact details, the cell phone number of the client, and the email address before you cross the border, so that if the officer wants to contact the facility. Is there any other advice or best practices that you can share with anybody who's going to be crossing the border to get a TN?
I have a couple things. If you're flying into the U.S., which a lot of the nurses are, there's something called PFI, Pre-Flight Inspection. And Canada is one of the very few countries in the world where the U.S. immigration officers are actually at the Canadian airport. So they're in Canada, they're not in the U.S. So you should get to the airport at least an hour before you usually would get to the airport to fly into the U.S., because that officer is going to put you through, oh, let me see your letter from the employer. Let me see your visa screen certificate. All the documents that you're going to have to go through. So you don't want to come very late and your flight's taking off and the officer saying, sorry, I can't let you on the flight because I'm not finished with your interview. So yeah, please come in a timely fashion. If something as we said before, Canadians are visa free. So it's really great. You don't have to go to a U.S. consulate or embassy to get a visa stamped on your passport. You either go to a border crossing or pre-flight inspection at an airport, and just make sure that you follow Connetics has an excellent document about what pieces of paper you have to have with you in order to cross into the United States. And then, just make sure when you're asked if the Border Patrol person, would you want to stay in the United States permanently? No. This is a temporary job opportunity. You can get your TN for 3 years. You can extend it indefinitely, 3 years at a time, but you're not supposed to have any intent to stay permanently. And I think Denise and Jennifer probably have some other tips to add to that.
Thank you. Those were very informative. Anything to add to that, Denise or Jennifer?
Just make sure that the passports are current.
Important.
And if they're traveling with their immediate relatives, make sure you have the birth certificates of the minor children under the age of 21, and that you have your marriage certificate with your spouse, that their passports are current. And I agree with definitely with everything that Carl said, and Tanya, you as well, when you mentioned that it would be best if they traveled during work hours. So if the officer has any questions from the employer is available, and make sure that it's simple, easy for them to get in contact with the employer, not dial one of these numbers where you have a million different departments that you're going to, and you never get to the person unless you hit 0 sometimes. So they should have the number of the HR person who's in charge, who's knowledgeable of the process, not someone who's not knowledgeable. There could be someone who doesn't even handle that. They just printed the letter that they're traveling with as evidence of the offer of employment. The letter should include the name of the person who was responsible for the process from beginning to end internally at the employer site, and their mobile number if it's available, a quick way of an officer being able to access the company. I've seen situations where they've tried reaching out to me as the attorney, but they first tried reaching out to the employer and they couldn't get in contact with them, so they contact me, and then they ask questions and everything turns out well, but what if I'm not available? So it's really important that the employer letter be thorough, that it even reference the section of the regulations that allow nurses that are on the list to apply for the TN. So those are just a few to add on to what you and Carl mentioned. And Jennifer, if you want to add some as well.
Well, I mean, I think you guys touched on it. I think it's always helpful. You know, I tell my clients, well, obviously, if they come to me, we're going to prepare a nice package for them to present. But, you know, being organized, because no matter what, you're probably going to be a little nervous just because it's it should be a secure thing, but you never know what'll happen at the border. So I always tell people arrive early, you know, have your documents if you need to have them in like a folder organized nicely in a nice packet for the officer. It'll make it easier for you and the officer as well to go through and verify everything. You know, travel during work hours, again, so you can, if they need to contact someone, someone's going to answer the phone. And then, yeah, of course, if you have your family members, make sure to bring all those original documents so they can verify the relationship. And I know we didn't touch on derivatives, but you know, that is something that is available. So you can bring your family.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. We're going to speak about the family in a little bit more detail as the last question. But I think all of that is really good advice. And I think the last thing that I would just add is for many nurses, they, as Jennifer said, they get, you know, it's nerve-wracking to go through the border, and people get very nervous and very anxious about it. But at the end of the day, it's important to be educated, and that's why we do the show Onward and Upward, is so that you can educate yourself about the process. You can know what is expected. You can know what's probably going to happen, and you can know what documents you need. You can be organized in how you present those documents. So really important to educate yourself about this. And if you have any friends or colleagues that you know are going to be coming to the US on the TN, please forward this email, this video to them, because we are paying this forward for you. We want you to pay that forward for other nurses that are looking to come to the US. And the one thing that I would just kind of finish off in terms of the process is just to bear in mind that the officer that will be evaluating you is just doing their job. You're not doing anything sinister or untoward. They're just trying to check, are you a real nurse? And is this a real job offer? So that's really all they're trying to evaluate. And we don't know who that officer is going to be. You know, sometimes you get somebody who's really nice and kind and sweet and friendly, and sometimes you get someone who's maybe in a little bit of a bad mood that day. So nobody knows, you know, how that officer is going to be. But at the end of the day, if you are educated, if you are prepared, you're a real nurse, it's a real job, and you know, it should be really hopefully a smooth process. So I think that covers the process. We're getting a lot of questions. I see there's one from David Salcido. Hi, David. I know David. And there's one here from Robert who's asking about, if you're on a TN from Canada, then petitioned for an EB3, while on the process of EB3, can you fly out of the US, or do you need to stay in the US?
It really depends how you're applying for the green card. If you're adjusting your status in the U.S., then you should wait for, it's called an advanced parole. It takes about 6 months. And then you can travel anywhere. You can travel to Canada, the Philippines, anywhere in the world. If, on the other hand, you're going to get your green card at one of the U.S. consulates in Canada, then you can travel in and out of the U.S. on your TN. Okay,
thank you, Carl. And we are out of time. I don't know how that happened. We've got so many questions. I'm going to ask one last question, and that is from Amal, who is saying, I'm a Canadian citizen. I don't have experience, but I've passed the Nclex, waiting for the visa screen. Is it possible to find a job? The answer, Amal, is yes. We have many employers all over the US that will even take Canadian new grads. So if you are looking to come to the US, please apply to Connetics USA /application. We have many, many opportunities right now in acute care hospitals, nursing homes, rehab facilities, surgery centers in all 50 states. So many, many options. The last topic that we wanted to just cover was the spouses and how that works. So bringing your family to the US if they are coming on the TN, because we know that that's called the TD. And if the spouse is a Canadian or Mexican citizen, we have a graphic on how that will work. And we're going to be showing that graphic now on how that will work. And perhaps, I don't know, you can choose. I'm trying to give everybody equal time. And maybe Jennifer, if you can maybe talk us through, if the spouse is, if you have a spouse and kids and you're a Canadian citizen, how does that work if you're a spouse and kids that are Mexican? Carl, if you can talk about that. And Denise, if you can talk about if the nurse is a Canadian citizen, but the spouse is maybe a Filipino citizen and doesn't have citizenship in Canada, how does that work?
Sure. So I guess I'll start. So if your spouse is also a Canadian citizen, the good news is they don't have to go through the visa process because Canadians are exempt from that. So that all they really need is a valid passport and proof of the relationship. So obviously your marriage certificate and proof that they're a Canadian citizen. So their passport should suffice for that. But they can apply with you at the border if you're traveling together. And that's because they're Canadian, they don't need to go to the consulate. They don't need to do a DS-160 application or any of that because they're visa exempt.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And can you just add to that how it works in terms of working? Can the spouse, they can come on the TN, but can they work?
So the spouse cannot work. So they can go to school, but that's not going to be a work authorization. I believe I'm correct on that, right?
And unless they are an occupation that is on
right,
the list
of themselves, right? Yeah,
correct. Okay. So there is a list of occupations. You can see that on our website of occupations that would qualify for the TN, and obviously registered nurses are one of them. And Carl, do you want to just talk a little bit about the spouses on the Mexico?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So in the big difference in Mexico is that there's no visa exemption. So the nurse and the nurse's spouse and the nurse's kids all have to apply for visas at the consulate in Mexico. So the nurse would apply for TN, the spouse and kids would apply for TD visas, trade dependent, they call that. And of course, as has been said before, they'll need to show the marriage certificate and the birth certificates.
Okay, thank you, Carl. And Denise, the last category, if the nurse is a Canadian citizen or and the spouse is not a Canadian citizen, how does that work?
Well, as Jennifer mentioned, if they have Canadian nationality, then it's simple enough. They're visa exempt. But the primary applicant would qualify with the primary applicant who is Canadian nationality wouldn't need the visa when they cross, but then their spouse and their minor children would need visas.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for your time. We went a little over time, so but there were so many really important, good questions that we are really grateful to Denise, Jennifer, and Carl for giving your time. We know how busy you are, and we really appreciate your expertise and your advice and your pointers and tips for any nurse that's coming on the TN visa. I think that this gave enormous clarity to many nurses who have so many questions and can find this process so confusing. To finish off, the panel have agreed that they will go into the chat after this after this session and answer any questions that we weren't able to get to. We tried to get through as many questions as possible. Question here from, I think it's Cosette, is asking, can you sponsor Nclex and Ielts for nurses? So just to share with you, I have shared throughout the show, but just to share with you that Connetics, Summit Connetics initiatives, we do have an Nclex Scholarship. So we do have a scholarship for selected nurses. You're welcome to apply, and we can evaluate if you'd be eligible for that. If not, pass the Nclex on your own, and we can place you then. We also have an Ielts Scholarship. This is for Connetics USA nurses. Thank you to the panel for your time, your expertise, and as we say, onward and upward.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.